Hello and welcome to this Federalist Society webinar. This afternoon, Thursday, December 5th, we have a webinar on whether there is a business case for racial and ethnic diversity in corporate leadership. My name is Ryan Lacey, and I'm an Associate Director for the In-House Counsel Network here at the Federalist Society. As always, please note that all expressions of opinion are those of our expert on today's call. Today, we are fortunate to have an excellent speaker in Dr. Sanjai Bhagat, whom I will introduce very briefly. Dr. Bhagat is a professor of finance at the University of Colorado. Previously, he has taught finance at Princeton University and the University of Chicago. After our speaker gives his opening remarks, we will turn to you, the audience, for questions. If you have a question, please enter it into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will handle questions as we can toward the end of this afternoon's program. With that, thank you for being with us today. Dr. Bhagat, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ryan. Can you please go back one slide, please? Okay, so that was the first slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So I'd like to thank the organizers of this webinar, the Federalist Society, for hosting this webinar, and I thank you for attending. So the question is there a business case for racial and ethnic diversity for corporate leadership? And the short answer is no. And in the next hour or less, I'll try to give you the insights for why the answer is no. When I refer to corporate leadership, we are talking about the C-suite, meaning the CEO, the CFO, the chief marketing officer, the chief operational officer, may include the chief legal officer. So we refer to them as the C-suite, and I will use that term interchangeably between corporate leadership and C-suite. So next slide, please. In 2015, McKinsey, well-known and one of the more prominent management consulting companies, originally from the US, but now they have a very strong international presence. They came out with a study, and they did two follow-up studies in 2017 and 2020 that basically tried to address the question whether corporations that have a more diverse C-suite, whether their financial performance is superior compared to companies whose C-suite is less racially and ethnically diverse. Next slide, please. So the managing partner of McKinsey, Dame Vivian Hunt, this is how she concludes in one of their studies. And since that time, they have reinforced this conclusion in all of their three studies. And what she's saying is that their data shows that companies that have more diverse leadership teams are more successful. And so the leading companies in our data sets are pursuing diversity because it's a business imperative and it drives real business results. Now, this is a pretty strong conclusion. And when I first saw this study and the subsequent studies, I was a little, I guess, surprised, but quite skeptical. I have been doing research in corporate finance and advising CEOs and board members of public and private companies. And corporate CEOs, CFOs put a lot of emphasis in trying to improve their business performance, and it is not easy. And what McKinsey was suggesting was a very easy, and I will give you the background for why I call it easy. an easy way to improve the financial performance of their company. So I was skeptical, but I said, let's consider what they have in this study and see what we can learn from it. Next slide, please. And let's go back one slide, please. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So the McKinsey study has significantly impacted corporations, regulators, exchanges. So one example would be the investment policies of BlackRock. BlackRock is, as you know, one of the largest asset management companies, both in the US and the world. And BlackRock, citing the McKinsey study or referring to it, has started, around 2019, 2020 to encourage the boards and the leadership of the companies whose stock it would own, that they should try to have a more racially and ethnically diverse corporate leadership. Similar emphasis by companies like Raytheon, JP Morgan, and Intel. The SEC's disclosure regulation regarding diversity of corporate board members also has referred to this McKinsey study, as has the NASDAQ's listing requirement. Now, if you notice, I have hyperlinks on my slides to the underlying studies or papers or data. And the organizers of this webinar will provide you with a copy of my slides, and the slides have hyperlinks to the background papers and data. Next slide, please. The implementation of diversity and DEI initiatives has become a billion-dollar revenue source for many business consulting companies, including, or especially, McKinsey and Deloitte, though other consulting companies like Accenture, Calco, and LMI Consulting are also generating significant revenue from this advising operating companies, corporations, with how to initiate and organize diversity and DEI initiatives in their company. And during the last 5 or 6 years, I work with board members, CEOs, and when I would attend some of these board meetings, I would often find one of the what they call service providers, like a McKinsey or a Deloitte or Accenture, their representative, and they would be very aggressive in promoting what they call their products or their suite of products that would enable or help the company to initiate and incorporate diversity and DEI initiatives. And they would refer to the McKinsey study as the reason why the corporate board or the CEO should do just that. I mean, I thought it was conflict of interest for Deloitte to first have, having done those studies, and I'll tell you why those studies are problematic from a scientific viewpoint, and then refer to their own studies in their marketing, in the marketing of their services. So that was another reason for my skepticism about what McKinsey was trying to do. Next slide, please. So I will highlight 4 problems with the McKinsey study, or the set of 3 studies. And these problems, essentially would negate any scientific empirical study. So, McKinsey claims to be an empirical study, meaning they look at actual data and they report results from the data, and then they try to make inferences. But in order to do that, you have to adhere to some level of scientific methodology, which they have not done. And I will give you the details here. So the first problem with the McKinsey study is that its results cannot be replicated by other researchers. McKinsey has considered 186 public US and Canadian companies in their sample. So they look at these 186 companies, look at the corporate leadership, the C-suite, racial and ethnic diversity of the C-suite, and then they correlate that with the financial performance of these companies. Now, McKinsey has declined to disclose the criterion by which these 186 companies were selected. So they have not done that, nor have they disclosed the names of these companies. So if there were an outside independent researcher and they wanted to replicate McKinsey's study, there is absolutely no way that they can do that. That's the first problem, and this is not just a nitpicky type concern. You know, if you cannot replicate a study, then you cannot qualify that study as a scientific evidence. So that's the first problem with the McKinsey study, is that other researchers are unable to replicate the study. Next slide, please. This problem has to do with that McKinsey's financial performance measure is not typical in the scientific finance literature. So McKinsey's financial performance is looking at a company's earnings before interest and taxes and comparing that to the earnings before interest and taxes of all other companies in that country, and then seeing whether the company's earnings were above or below the median of the earnings before interest and taxes of the other companies in that country. Now, this is a rather unusual measure of financial performance. Indeed, before reading the McKinsey study, I had never seen this measure used in any other finance or accounting or economic study, and I've been reading this literature rather carefully for the last 2 decades or longer. So what we have from the finance literature, and these are not my papers, I have references to the underlying papers here. The finance literature recommends that we use size and industry adjusted return on assets as the measure of operating financial performance. Now, why McKinsey chose to not use this but constructed their own measure, they have never explained that. And there is a good reason why finance researchers use the size and industry adjusted return on assets. This measure has been found to be, most powerful in determining abnormal performance when it is there, and also determining when you do not have abnormal financial performance to demonstrate that. So that is the second problem with the McKinsey study. The third problem, next slide, please. The third problem has to do with McKinsey's measure of diversity, racial and ethnic diversity in the C-suite. So for a company to have a perfect racial and ethnic diversity score, as per McKinsey, this company would need to have an equal number, I emphasize, an equal number of Black, Hispanic, white, South Asian, and East Asian executives. So for example, if a company had like six C-suite executives, CEO, CFO, CMO, Chief Operating Officer, Chief Legal Officer, maybe Chief Technology Officer. So if it has 6 executives in the C-suite, then for that company to have a perfect diversity score, as per McKinsey, they would need 1 Black executive in there, 1 Hispanic, 1 white, 1 South Asian, and 1 East Asian. So if they did that, then the company would have a perfect diversity score. Now, the problem with that measure of diversity is that neither the overall US population nor the US labor force has an equal number of people in those racial ethnic groups. Even the most ardent of diversity activists, they would advocate a proportionate representation of ethnic and racial groups in corporate leadership positions. What does that mean? So, for example, if you have a racial or ethnic group that that has a 50% representation in the U.S. population or the U.S. labor force, then if there are 6 executives in the C-suite, then these diversity advocates would say, well, maybe 3 would be from that racial or ethnic group because they have a 50% representation in the overall population. And then, for other racial groups that have a smaller level of representation in the overall U.S. population or the U.S. labor force, they would have a lesser number in the C-suite. So this is sort of another problem, and this becomes an issue when we look at other researchers who try to replicate their study. So instead of focusing on a proportionate representation of different ethnic and racial groups, which is what even the most ardent diversity advocate would suggest, McKinsey comes up with a measure that is almost unheard of, even in the diversity arenas, if you will. Next slide, please. And then this fourth problem with the McKinsey study, I've labeled it as a time inconsistency problem. And the way to think about it is what McKinsey does is it measures the financial performance of their 186 companies in the years 2014 through 2018, and then it looks at the diversity measure of these companies in 2019, and then tries to correlate that diversity in 2019 with the performance of these companies in the earlier period, 2014 through 2018. Now, this methodology makes absolutely no sense. If we stipulate that, let's, for the sake of the argument, agree that diversity, that racial and ethnic diversity does impact financial performance. Let's stipulate that. If that's the case, then the way you'd go and sort of document that, or the way you'd go about verifying that, is to look at the diversity of a certain set of companies, say in the year 2013, and then you would look at the performance, the financial performance of these companies in the years 2014 through 2018, and then you do the correlation between these two, diversity and performance. And if you find a statistically significant positive relation, then you could argue that diversity perhaps positively impacts financial performance. That ought to have been their empirical setup, but they didn't do that. They did something that is totally wrong. I mean, what McKinsey is saying is we look at performance of a company first and then look at diversity after. So that's another what I have labeled as the time inconsistency problem of the McKinsey study. Next slide, please. So, I've been aware of the problem with the McKinsey study for quite some time. And then I was, I found very interesting that there is this recent study by 2 economists, one from Texas A&M University and the other from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. These economists, as the title of their study indicates, Diversity Matters Revisited in the S&P 500 Firms. Their paper is available to you. It's publicly available. and you can click on those hyperlinks when you get the slides, and you can see the paper for yourself, and I will try to summarize their findings for you. So these authors essentially are trying to replicate the McKinsey study. Now, obviously, they do not have access to the 186 companies that McKinsey used, nor did McKinsey give the criteria as to why they picked these 186 companies. So these authors, said, okay, let's look at the entire all 500 of the S&P 500 companies. And, that's a pretty reasonable way of picking your sample that you're going to study. I mean, the S&P 500 is a well-known set of companies. The list is publicly available. The criteria for inclusion in the S&P 500 is also publicly available. And most important, that list of companies is constructed by somebody other than the researchers themselves. So here, the list of the S&P 500 clearly is constructed by S&P and not by the researchers. So what they did, I think, is a lot more defensible and reasonable. Okay, let's look at all the 500 of the S&P 500 companies. And let's go to the next slide, please. So here is a graphical representation of one of their results. This graph is not mine. This graph is from the paper by these economists, whose paper you can access through the web links on my slide. So what do we have on this graph? So on the graph, on the x-axis or the horizontal axis, we have the diversity measure going from 0 to 1 of the 500 S&P 500 companies. 1 would mean perfect diversity, 0 meaning not diverse at all, meaning not diverse at all with regard to the racial and ethnic composition of the C-suite. You'll notice that we don't have any companies of the S&P 500 that would meet a perfect diversity measure as per McKinsey's measure. And the other companies, the other 500 companies are, somewhere between 0 and 1. There are many companies that have a zero diversity measure as per McKinsey's measure. On the vertical axis, you have the financial performance measure that these authors have constructed. Now, these authors have looked at the more traditional finance performance measure, return on assets. They also have included the McKinsey measure for good measure. They've also looked at stock market returns. So they look at a composite measure, and what you're seeing on the y-axis is a composite measure. And if you just look at these at this graph and then try to draw the line of best fit, that line of best fit is very flat, meaning what the flat line or the line of best fit, what that flat line means is that there is no relationship between the racial and ethnic composition of the C-suite and the financial performance of that company. So this graphically, summarizes the main result from this study that we are talking about by economists Green and Hand. Now, they also do much more carefully constructed statistical tests using regressions and other techniques to basically demonstrate the same point in a more careful, thorough manner. Next slide, please. These authors were also very concerned about the rather unusual diversity measure that McKinsey has used. And the previous graph that that we just saw, that was based on McKinsey's racial and ethnic diversity score measure, meaning, that you would get a diversity score of 1, a perfect score, if there were an equal number of individuals from the different racial ethnic groups. As we have just argued earlier, neither the overall US population nor the US labor force has an equal number of people in the racial ethnic groups. And even the most ardent diversity activists, they will only, or they would, at most advocate for a proportionate representation of different ethnic and racial groups in corporate leadership positions. So let's get to the next slide. please. Thank you. So here, the authors are using that proportionate diversity measure, and they're trying to relate that with the financial performance measure, or an average of different financial performance measures, including the one that McKinsey used. And there are a lot of numbers on this slide, and I apologize for the small print of those numbers. You will have ample opportunity. This table comes from this paper. This is not my table. A lot of numbers in here, and I won't drag you through that. But you can look at those numbers when you get access to that my slide, and then the hyperlink paper. You can go to this table yourself. Basically, what this table, the results from this table indicates that there is a negative relation between diversity and financial performance. I will hasten to add that this negative relation is not statistically significant. However, what does a negative relation between diversity and financial performance mean? So if you were to just look at the raw results of this study, a negative relation, what that means is companies that have a more diverse, racial and ethnically diverse C-suite, as measured by this proportionate diversity measure, their financial performance is worse than companies that have a less racial and ethnic diverse C-suite. So that's what their study done for the entire S&P 500 group of companies. That's what it implies, but the result again is not statistically significant. So if you wanted to argue that there is no relationship between racial and ethnic diversity and financial performance, that inference would be justified on the basis of these results. Next slide, please. So now a little bit of introspection. One would have to ask the question is, why are McKinsey's claims false or misleading? Or as to what might be the underlying economic problem or financial reason why McKinsey's claims are misleading or maybe even false. So their claims are, and they make that in their studies, is that for every 10% increase in racial and ethnic diversity on the senior executive team, earnings before interest and taxes rise by 0.8%. That's their claim. And I did some quick back of the envelope type calculations. And what I determined, and I'm happy to share those calculations, they're not that difficult to do. For a typical S&P 500 company, the above earnings increase would translate to about $60 million in market cap of that company. So what that means is that if you really believe that McKinsey's claims are true, then all that a company has to do is to recruit one additional or replace existing C-suite member with a racial or ethnically diverse C-suite member. And if they were to do that, the market cap of their company would go up by $60 million. And that to me is like, a dead giveaway with regard to, what the problem with the McKinsey study is. I said, look, what's the cost of recruiting racially or ethnically diverse C-suite member? I mean, you can think of a CFO or a chief operating officer, chief marketing officer, chief legal officer, chief technology officer, any of those C-suite executives. What does it cost to hire them? I mean, you have to hire a recruiting company. They have some fees and so forth. And then when you hire them, you got to pay them, but you would have had to pay somebody in that position anyways. So that pay would actually cancel out. So the incremental cost of hiring a racially or ethnically diverse C-suite member is the fee that you have to pay to the recruiting company or the headhunter that you might call them. And, what's the size of those fees? It's, to be generous, to the McKinsey argument, the size of these fees would be $500,000 in most cases, 1 million on the high side. So what you're looking at is a company could spend $500,000, and by spending $500,000, they've increased their market cap by 60 million. I mean, that looks like a pretty good way for a company to increase its market value. Unfortunately, in real world, things are never that easy. And that's why I was very skeptical of the McKinsey results. And this gives you a sort of insight as to why the results are flawed. Next slide, please. So, so far, we've been talking about ethnic and racial diversity in the C-suite, meaning the corporate leadership, the CEO, the CFO, etc. There is another strand of the literature that would be relevant to this discussion, and that has to do with gender diversity among corporate board members. So how does gender diversity impact the gender diversity among corporate board members impact the financial performance of that company? This topic has been studied extensively, and there's a fairly large literature on that. That the statistical methodology in these studies is somewhat problematic, so I won't get too much into it. But a more recent study looked at this same question and came up with a fairly, what I'd say, remarkable set of results. So what is this study? So this study looked at California Senate Bill SB 826. Now, this bill was passed by the California legislature in 2018, and it requires public companies headquartered in California to have at least one woman director by the end of 2019. And, and for extended periods, meaning 2020, 2021, they would need to have more women directors. For example, a company that had 6 board members, they would need to have at least 3 women directors by the end of 2021 if that company was headquartered in California. So, this was announced to, I guess, the stock market at large in 2018. The decision of the state legislature was somewhat unexpected, but anyways, that's what they decided. And as a footnote, I sort of, as I've noted there, in 2022, a California court ruled that this SB 826 violated the California Constitution. So it is no longer legal. It's no longer a legal mandate in California, but it still seems to be something that many boards of companies headquartered in California are adhering to and are trying to move in the direction of this law that the court has ruled as unconstitutional. So, what do the researchers find? Next slide, please. So what these researchers found that in 2018, when the California legislature announced this new law, SB 826, the share prices of companies headquartered in California went down by 1.2%. Now, if you're thinking about a company that has a market cap of, let's say, $10 billion, 1% of $10 billion is a significant loss in shareholder value. You can do the math yourself. If you have a $100 billion company, which is not that unusual nowadays, a 1% loss would be $1 billion loss for the market cap or the shareholder value of that company. More interestingly, what these authors document is that the share prices were more negative in the number of women directors that were needed. For example, the share prices dropped by 1.06% for firms that had to add one woman director by 2021. On the other hand, the share prices dropped by a larger amount, meaning 1.64% for firms that had to add three women directors by 2021. This drop in the share price of companies impacted by this California law suggests that government mandates to increase gender diversity among corporate directors negatively impacts their financial performance. Now, here, clearly, we are only looking at gender diversity. This study did not look at racial or ethnic diversity. The California law did not address that. So they only could look at gender diversity. But when they did look at, and this is looking at gender diversity for corporate board directors, not for corporate C-suite. So there is that difference. But the fact that the author of the document significant drop in the shareholder value of companies impacted by the government mandate for increasing gender diversity among corporate directors certainly suggests that diversity mandates, if recommended by government laws or regulations, are certainly not in the interest of shareholders of a company. Next slide, please. So I'll conclude here, and then I will take your questions if you have any. So the main conclusion is that there is no business case for diversity in the C-suite. So again, there is no business case for diversity in the C-suite, meaning that if your corporate leadership is racially and ethnically more diverse, there is no evidence that your racially and ethnically more diverse corporate leadership will lead to better financial performance. Now, the question that might come up is there a social or moral case for diversity in the C-suite? I think that's a fair question to ask and a reasonable question to raise. However, business consultants like McKinsey, Accenture, and others that have developed their business models to provide advice to corporations on how they can increase their diversity. These business consultants, they do not have an expertise to opine on this question related to social and moral case for diversity in the C-suite. So with that, I thank you for your time. I'm happy to welcome your questions.
And thank you so much, Dr. Bhagat, for that presentation and for your expertise here. I'm going to take moderator's privilege and ask one question to start us off, and then we can turn to some other audience questions. And for those who are watching, you can put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Just type them out, and we will get to them as we can. So my first question is, you raised a lot of objections to the study, the McKinsey studies, and presumably other people have raised some of these objections as well. Has there been any pushback on these objections? Like, what are the people who would defend this McKinsey study saying about the objections that you raised?
So I've followed this literature. The paper or the research by Green and Hand, the economists from North Carolina and Texas A&M, their study in the unpublished version has been available at least since 2021. It's my understanding that McKinsey has had an access to that. That study has been available in public websites, public research websites. That's how I accessed that study. Anybody could have accessed that study in 2021. It's my understanding that McKinsey had access to that study in 2021, had chosen to not respond to it. I've not heard any of the defenders of the McKinsey study address the four critiques or the four problems with the McKinsey study, which I have laid out. And my challenge to McKinsey is still open. Why do they not provide the list of 186 companies? And let's see if other researchers can replicate their study with more scientifically valid performance measures. So, that would be fairly straightforward. But since we don't have McKinsey's list, I think looking at the entire set of 500 S&P 500 companies, I think it's a pretty reasonable way to, address this question.
Great. And now moving to some audience questions, and reminder to everybody that the Q&A function is at the bottom of your screen. And as a reminder, we will be sending out the slides that Dr. Bhagat was showing during the presentation out to all the attendees. So be on the lookout for that as well. So our first question is, if a study concluded that more diversity led to poorer financial performance, do you think that study would ever see the light of day or be picked up by any publications or corporations?
Let me see if I understand the question correctly. So if a study showed that more diversity if you can repeat your question, please.
Led to poorer financial performance. So the opposite of
poorer. Okay, so greater diversity leads to lower financial performance. Well, this study that I just referred to, it recently has been published in a journal, and you have linked to that in the overhead that you will get access to shortly at the conclusion. I guess the organizers of this webinar will give you access to my slides, and that's hyperlinked to this study. So yeah, it's been published, but let me note this. The academic finance literature, and I include finance and financial accounting, they're sort of overlapping disciplines, and some areas in economics are also overlapping with finance. So when I use finance, I mean some areas in economics and accounting too. Historically, the finance literature has been pretty neutral in looking at controversial topics, and you could expect that the editors of the finance journal would require people to just uphold the highest standards of statistical methodology and report the results as you see it, and then you can infer what you want, but the data and the results have to be ironclad. Now, my reading of the more recent, meaning the last 4 or 5 years of the papers in finance and accounting and in economics, especially papers that are looking at the issues having to do with the green energy policies, environmental policies, ESG policies. ESG stands for environment, social, and governance. I've been doing research in governance for more than 2 decades. So, these are the kinds of research I read and do on an ongoing basis. What I found is that, now there are exceptions, of course, but what I found is that all of the top finance journals, they seem to have shown preference for studies that highlight a positive relationship between, let's say, a green energy policy and some measure of financial performance or operating accounting profits. And if your results are different, I mean, if your results contradict what's in the existing literature, meaning if they contradict the fact that some green energy policy or some diversity policy is having a negative impact on performance. Some of those papers still get published. The paper I referred, the second paper that I went in some detail about the California law, that SB 286, having to do with gender diversity in corporate boards of companies headquartered in California. That study has been published in a well-known peer-reviewed finance journal. So it is the case that finance journals do publish papers that run counter to sort of this ESG philosophy. But my experiences and my understanding is, talking to other finance researchers, that the editors of the top finance journals seem to have a strong preference for papers that provide a positive relation between some environment or green energy policy or diversity policy and financial performance. Now there are clearly exceptions, and I have discussed one of those papers with you. So I'm not saying this is a universal thing, but you know, there is that unfortunate, and this is the first example I've seen in the academic finance literature where the editor's philosophy and preferences, or ideology and preferences, has you know, has had an impact on what does get published. So I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Great. Moving on to the next question. One of our attendees asks, on the gender diversity impact, was the decline in value isolated to the relative performance of the stock during the time period of the gender required firms as compared to the performance of other companies not impacted?
Oh yeah. So I didn't highlight the study, you know, details very carefully. Yeah, this study, I mean, like, you know, most finance studies that come in top peer-reviewed journals, if you're looking at stock market data, you have to control for the market movements. You have to control for the risk of the stock. You have to control for the industry stock price movements, and the authors did all of that. So, you know, in that sense, that study is fairly careful. They have adhered to scholarship standards in what is referred to as the event study methodology, which is, you know, looking at the impact of some event, in this case, that California law, on the share prices. So yes, they did do that.
Perfect. Our next question, have you looked at this question more broadly across a corporation? For example, a few layers below the C-suite level. And if so, what are the conclusions?
I have not done that research. I'm not aware of any credible research that looks at that. The research that I've cited, meaning of racial and ethnic diversity, this paper by Green and Hand that I showed you, you know, some of their graphs and tables, that's the only credible study I'm aware of that specifically looks at the racial and ethnic diversity of corporate employees. In this case, they, of course, look at corporate C-suite leadership. The broader corporate employee racial ethnic composition, I think it'd be an interesting topic to study. I just haven't, and somebody may have done that. I just haven't seen a study like that. I do read this literature. I've not seen any references to what I would refer to as credible studies. Now, I will caution, I mean, I will try to be transparent. I mean, there's a very large literature now that looks at various aspects of E, S, and G. So E is for environment, S is for social. So the social would include this racial and ethnic diversity issues. So and then G is the more traditional governance issues, like having to do with compensation of executives, board structure, and so forth. There's a very large literature looking at various aspects of E, meaning environment, green energy policies, S, social diversity, uh, other aspects of S that I can get into. There's a large literature that has been written not just by finance researchers, but now or economic researchers, but now you have researchers in sociology, you have researchers in law school, you have researchers in geography departments. I mean, nothing wrong if somebody wants to study a topic, but clearly, this issue about green energy policies and diversity and equity and inclusion. I mean, these issues are some of the more, I think, important issues in our society today. And to that extent, I admire and applaud scholars in all disciplines wanting to study it. But as it turns out, those studies have a lot of methodological problems. And so it's hard to rely on the statistical inference of these studies. The reason I highlighted the McKinsey study is because that's the one that gets referred to most often by corporations when they have tried to implement their own diversity programs, and by BlackRock and SEC and the NASDAQ. Now, I will note that in the last year or so, given the pushback from investors, pushback from the attorney generals of various states, mostly conservative states, if you might, as you can imagine. So because of the pushback from attorney generals of various states, many corporations and then many of these large institutional investors like BlackRock, they've started to back off from their strong, at least on the face of their discussions, their strong recommendation of diversity initiatives for companies. So I think the pendulum is, I think, starting to swing back the other way. But I'd caution you that many companies, and I would also include other nonprofit institutions in that. I saw on boards, I talked to board members, I talked to CEOs, they seem to have a very strong commitment to this diversity. Many of them, in spite of the Supreme Court ruling and the pushback from the attorney generals, their responses, we will still continue to do the same. We'll just try to be more discreet about it. So I think that many leaders in corporate America continue to believe that diversity, and they will also say that we are doing diversity because it's going to improve our financial performance. And when I highlight the fact that the results don't substantiate what they're saying, they usually do not have a good answer.
Great. We have time for one or two more questions. This is a longer one from one of our audience members. He says, some public advocacy organizations publish lists of companies that either adhere to or eschew certain behaviors as a means to encourage or discourage patronage, investment, etc. Which seems like it could have a direct impact regardless of an independent business merit, how a business merits diversity hiring, etc. Was this a factor in the McKinsey or other studies, and how could one control for it? And if particularly power groups are using it as an approach to for these C-suites in regards to diversity?
Yeah, so neither the McKinsey studies nor the Green and Hand study, which I discussed, specifically looks at individual companies that may get pressured or impacted by some pressure groups for certain social or environmental policies. Again, there's a very vast literature on that. People have looked at impact of certain green energy policies or certain social policies that one company was pressured into adhering or moving away from. My reading of that literature is that those efforts tend to be misguided. And this goes back to, you have to ask the question, what is it that corporations or the corporate managers, the CEO and board members, what are they trying to do? Now, of course, they'll talk about many things, they're trying to look for their customers and, serve the employees and so forth. But at some level, they will all admit that their focus is on creating and sustaining long-term shareholder value. Obviously, they have to abide by the law of the land. What I mean by the law of the land is OSHA regulations, EPA regulations, Department of Labor regulations. So they have to adhere to all of these. But within that, they are trying to maximize the long-term shareholder value. Now, in doing that, any sensible CEO is going to pay attention to providing good benefits, good compensation, good work environment for their employees. Because if they don't treat their employees well, they will lose those employees. And not only will they lose those employees, they will have a hard time attracting other good employees. And, as the old saying goes, happy employees make happy customers. If you don't have happy employees, you don't have customers. If you don't have customers, you don't have anything. You don't have a company. So any manager, even if they're not thinking about their employees, they're not thinking about their customers, if only that their focus is on long-term shareholder value, but in doing that, they will have to focus on the welfare, the well-being of the employees. They will have to focus on the interests and the well-being of their customers. They will have to focus on, environmental regulations. So many of the things that the green energy advocates, diversity advocates are talking about, these are things that the manager, the CEO will be doing some of that anyways. The only issue is that if you let the managers do it in their way, then they will use the discipline of long-term shareholder value in balancing the interests of, say, employees and the environment and the customer and so forth. Now, this is not a academic discussion. Let me give you a concrete example. Recently, General Motors and other auto companies in the US, I'll take the example of General Motors in 2019. Their managers had to make a decision. They were looking at a set of assembly lines in Ohio and Michigan that were at that point producing cars and trucks that would run on gasoline and diesel. Now, they could replace these gasoline, diesel assembly lines to make electric cars and trucks. And electric cars and trucks, since it will be a newer assembly line, would require less workers. Now, these assembly lines in total employed about 3,000 workers. The electric car truck assembly lines being newer would require only 300 workers. So in going from gasoline, diesel assembly lines to electric car truck diesel lines, they would have to lay off 2,700 workers. So their choice was, let's say for the time being, that electric cars and trucks are better for the environment than gasoline cars and trucks, though the data, if you look at it more carefully, does not support that. But let's just say that electric cars and trucks are better for the environment. So if you want to do this thing that's better for the environment by going to electric cars and trucks, you're going to lay off 2,700 employees. Maybe you can employ back 700 of these employees somewhere else in your company. You're still laying off 2,000 employees, and laying off an employee is extremely negative for their interest. So how do you balance the interest of laying off 2,000 workers versus doing something good for the environment? If you think about it, in the absence of the shareholder value, there is no way for the managers to know what to do. And yet the managers have to do something. They either have to go to the new assembly line and then make electric cars and trucks, or they stay with what they have. So that's why this focus, or this extreme focus on diversity, racial ethnic diversity, or on green energy policies is counterproductive and internally inconsistent. Instead of that, I think we should let companies do what they have been doing all these years, and which is letting them maximize in long-term shareholder value while abiding by the law of the land, meaning EPA regulations, OSHA regulations. They have to adhere to all that. And if you look at the larger picture, it's the corporations, the corporate America, that has really lifted the quality of life of everybody living in our country, and not just our country. The same corporate model has also lifted the lives of billions of people in India, in China. Until they embrace the corporate framework in a serious way, their economies were struggling, and once they embrace that, their people have done very well. So before we start trying to move away from long-term shareholder value for corporations, let's give it a wider understanding. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Bhagat. And on behalf of the Federalist Society and the In-House Counsel Network, I want to thank you and our audience for being here today and for participating with those great questions. We welcome listener feedback by email at info@fed-soc.org. And as always, keep an eye on our website for emails and announcements about upcoming webinars and other events. Thank you all for joining us today. We are adjourned. Thank you, Doctor.